family and I lived in a quiet village way out in the countryside, but it was a long commute to work, so we decided to move closer to the city. After nearly a year of not finding a new home, we found an advertisement online wanting to do a property exchange. The only problem was we lived in a house and they lived in an apartment block that was in a crappy area. We didn't really want to, but we'd been waiting so long to find a place near the city, we reluctantly agreed. After a long day of travelling and humping furniture up 6 flights of stairs, we finally laid on our beds around midnight. But just as we closed our eyes, loud music came blasting through the apartment below us. We banged on the floor and shouted for them to turn it down, but the music just got louder. This went on for weeks and months, and we were physically and mentally exhausted. So we got the local authorities involved. The noise pollution team came and done their job, handing out several warnings and court orders, and even confiscating their stereo. But they just went out and brought a new one, and the noise continued. Then one day, we saw the woman whose flat it was that was causing the disturbance, and we asked her to stop. She just smiled and blew smoke in our faces. Later that night, it was abnormally quiet, and we surprisingly got some sleep. But at about 1 o'clock in the morning, we were awoken by a loud banging on our door. My wife and I quietly walked to the door and looked through the peephole and got the fright of our lives. About 5 or 6 hooded men were standing outside in the long corridor. They were just standing there, staring at our door. A few of them had baseball bats, and others were drinking alcohol from a bottle. They stayed outside for about 20 minutes, banging and kicking at our door. My wife phoned the police, who told us not to open the door, and who said they'll be there when they can. All the while I stood and watched through the peephole. Before the group of men left, the one nearest the door pulled out a knife and made a slashing gesture to his throat, before another threw a bottle at the door. The next day, I took my wife and daughter to stay with my parents, and only went back to the apartment to remove our stuff. This happened many years ago when I was a kid. I lived in the same house all my childhood and pretty much knew everybody on our street. It was a nice area and safe to play out with my friends. Then a new family moved into the house next to ours. They had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, and the boy was about the same age as me. I began to hang out with him and became quite good friends. This was in the summer holidays, so there was no school. But each time I saw him, I noticed different bruises on him, like he'd have one on his arm, then one on his leg. Then one day he had a black eye. I asked him how he got it, and he told me he fell off his bike and hit his face. His mum was quite nice, but I never really saw his dad much. He didn't really speak to my parents, and I would only see him coming and going to the house. But every now and then we would hear him shouting and banging, and it sounded like he had quite a nasty temper. I had never been into my friend's house, but one day when his parents were out, he asked me to come in. As we walked up the stairs to his bedroom, everything appeared to be normal. The house was clean and well decorated. We sat playing video games for a while, laughing and joking around. Then his dad walked into the room. He stood and stared at us both for a moment, surprised that I was here. Then he said, "Get out." We both got up to leave the room, but he told my friend to stay where he was. As I walked down the stairs, I could hear a whack and then my friend cry out in pain. This happened several times before I made it out the door. I told my mum and dad about what happened, and they said they would voice my concerns to my friend's parents, which they did. and that's when bad things started to happen. First, my dad's car tyres were slashed. Then in the middle of the night, a brick was thrown through our living room window. We were pretty sure it was my friend's dad, but he denied it. Creepy stuff like the house phone ringing in the early hours of the morning, and threatening letters made out of newspaper cuttings were posted through our door. This went on for several weeks. The police were informed, but there was no proof. My friend's dad had barred him from playing with me. Then one day, after we had returned home from a weekend visiting my grandparents, the family next door had moved out. The house was empty, and it was no coincidence that all the creepy stuff that had been happening to us finally stopped. A few years ago, I moved into a house with my wife and son. I had a new job that paid better than what I was used to, so we moved so I could be closer to work. Up until then, we had always lived in a small apartment block, so to move into a house was kind of a luxury to us. It was rented as we couldn't afford a mortgage at that point, but my wife and I didn't care. To get out of the small apartment into a spacious 2-bed house was a dream for us. The house was attached to one other house, lived in by a man whom we never really saw or heard, as he kept himself to himself. The first few days were great. I went to work while my wife stayed home looking after our young son. Then one night in bed, my wife said the house didn't feel right. She felt like she was being watched. I said, "What do you mean?" She replied that when she goes out with our son sometimes and returns home, some things are out of place, or a door is closed that she swore was left open. I told her not to worry, that it was probably nothing but her imagination. But the next evening, my wife rushed out of the bathroom with a towel wrapped around her, saying whilst laying in the bath looking up the ceiling, she noticed a small hole and thought she saw and heard something move. I tried to reassure her and gave her our young son to hold, while I went into the attic with a torch. It was dark and dusty, but nothing or no one was up there except for the odd spider web. But I did find a small round hole above the bathroom and promised my wife I would seal it up at the weekend. A few nights later, when we were getting into bed, my wife noticed what looked like bits of dried paint or plaster on the duvet. We both looked up at the ceiling above the bed where we could see yet another small round hole. I immediately grabbed my torch and went back into the attic, but once again I could see nothing or no one up there. I was about to climb down the attic steps when my light caught sight of the brick wall and what looked like uneven brickwork. I went over to look, and what I found were loose bricks, so I carefully removed them. The hole led into the neighbour's attic and was big enough to fit a body through. I placed the bricks back and told my wife what I had found. The next day we rang the police, who went round to talk to the neighbour. The man, who we never really saw or heard of, confessed to entering our home through the attic. Within a month we moved to another house.